World Chess Championship game number 7. We have probably the most exciting game of the match right here. We have Gukesh with the white pieces, Ding with the black pieces. We see one knight f3 by Gukesh. He does not want to play e4 and see that French defense again from Ding. d5, g3. This is called the King's Indian attack. Flexible option by Gukesh. g6. This is the current trend at the top level for what players like to play against the King's Indian attack. The idea is bishop g7 and a quick pawn to e5, building a big center. So now we see d4, bishop g7, c4. And this move is a bit rare by Gukesh. It seems like he's really inviting Ding Liren to capture that pawn. So we've seen this trend in the match. Gukesh likes to play with the initiative, and he is perfectly fine sacrificing pawns. And it seems that Ding Liren tends to like the material advantage. So this pawn has to be very tempting for him. But he decides not to take. Bishop g2, knight f6, castle, castle. And now we've transposed into what's called the Grunfeld defense. Over 10,000 games in this position. But on this very next move by Gukesh, move number 7, he plays rook e1. This is an extremely rare move, played in only 19 games. And it's a specialty of a German grandmaster named Rasmus Svein. I might be mispronouncing that name, but he's a young grandmaster from Germany. And it's interesting to see why he played this move. Does he potentially have a connection with this grandmaster? Time will tell. They haven't revealed all their seconds. D takes c4, and now we're in for a fight. Ding Liren says, all right, I will take that free pawn. And if you look at the computer advantage, it's slightly favoring black here. It's around a 0.1 advantage. But Gukesh plays e4, and he gets this big pawn center. Look at all of the squares these pawns control. So now we have a dynamic game. There's going to be winning chances for both sides. Bishop g4, pinning the knight. Knight b to d2. I'm looking to play knight takes c4 soon. Now here the top move is pawn to b5. And pawn to b5 just makes this pawn structure on the light squares where the c pawn can't be captured. But instead, Ding plays pawn to c5. And this is a mistake. After c5, Gukesh is able to play d5, securing this extra space with knight takes c4 coming soon. It really, Ding doesn't have any compensation. Pawn to e6 by Ding. h3, good move, because this bishop doesn't have anywhere to go. If it goes back to h5, it gets trapped. So it has to trade. Bishop takes back. E takes d. E takes d. And now you might be wondering, can knight takes d5 be played? It's not a good move, because after knight takes c4, we have a double attack on the knight. And this bishop is also eyeing the pawn, which traps the rook in the corner. So knight takes d5, not possible here. Knight b to d7 played. Knight takes c4. So Gukesh really got everything he could ask for out of the opening. He has the bishop pair. He has the passed pawn. He's got the space. He's got the monster knight on c4. What does Ding Liren have in return? A potentially weak pawn on d4, an isolated pawn on d4. So this opening has gone great for Gukesh, and he's got some good winning chances here. Pawn to b5, kicking the knight. Knight retreats, hitting the pawn. Queen b6, bishop f4, and look at these bishops. You can already tell that they're monsters, and they're trying to support the advance of this pawn. The rook's already on the open file, sitting on e1. Queen's well placed behind this passed pawn. So rook f8, queen d2, connecting the rooks. Rook to d8, and knight back to c2. This makes sense. That knight on a3 wasn't doing anything. How does this knight get in the game? Knight to c2, and we're going to see a nice idea by Gukesh here. Pawn to b4. So this pawn is defended by the knight. And the whole idea is if we get this c pawn to move, the c pawn is guarding these two squares. Well, those are the two squares this knight's looking at going to. Right? So b4 is kind of forcing the hand of this pawn on c5, which allows this knight to develop. Great move by Gukesh. c4. And you might be wondering, well, why would you allow the passed pawn? He's allowing Ding to get this passed c pawn so that his pieces can become more active. That's the whole idea. The knight can now land on d4. Bishop e3, hitting the queen. Queen moves, bishop d4. And now that bishop sits on the long diagonal all the way across the board, a1 to h8. And it's also on this diagonal. So that bishop is in an awesome spot. Rook takes e1, rook takes e1. And look what Gukesh does here again. He offers up this pawn sacrifice for activity. I love this playing style. Gukesh is playing for a win again. Rook a1, Now here there's a very tough decision for Ding. The two options are queen to b3 or pawn to c3. And he chose the wrong option. He played queen to b3, which is a mistake. The way he keeps this game in just tiny edge territory for Gukesh instead of big advantage for Gukesh is he has to find pawn to c3. And after bishop takes c3, he can now retreat his queen to c4. And after this kind of long line, bishop takes f6, rook takes a7, bishop c3, queen g5, Ding is down a pawn, but the advantage is still tiny for white. Ding got rid of that bishop pair. This pawn is stoppable, and Ding has adequate counterplay to keep this in draw territory, but it's still, Gukesh is going to be pressing for the win. Instead, we see a larger advantage for Gukesh after the move played in the game, queen b3. Rook a3 is the response, queen b1, king to g2, and now rook to d7 by Ding. So Ding is holding on to that extra pawn in this line, but it's giving Gukesh close to a winning advantage. He plays rook a5, and you can just tell Gukesh has the initiative, right? He keeps attacking things, making Ding react. He's still got both bishops on the board, which is very important. That bishop pair is super strong here. And this advantage is +2 according to the computer. If you've seen my previous recaps of the World Championship, I've talked about this +2 threshold. When the computer says +2, if it's above that, that tends to be winning with best play from both sides. If it's below +2, that tends to be in the draw territory with best play. So we're right at that +2 threshold here. Queen to b3, and what Ding wants to do is play queen to d3, offering the queen trade. And we've seen this interesting dynamic throughout this match. Ding Liren keeps going for these queen trades in positions where it's beneficial for him, and Gukesh D keeps trying to avoid the queen trades. Rook a3, hitting the queen and guarding the d3 square. Queen to b1, rook to a5, queen back to b3. So Gukesh needs to find something different. Ding's saying, I'm happy to repeat here in a worse position. Rook takes b5, and now queen to d3. And here, this is interesting. We have seen Gukesh make some minor mistakes when avoiding queen trades. This is another one. The strongest move is actually bishop to e3, allowing this queen trade, but the whole idea is you keep the dark square bishop and you still have the pass pawn. Instead, he plays queen out to f4. It's still a good attempt, but it's not quite as strong as allowing the queen trade, which is kind of counterintuitive. Queen takes c2 played, bishop takes f6, queen f5, and here's this dynamic again. Queen trade offer by Ding, and the strongest move is to defend the queen again with bishop to g5. This is an over 2-pawn advantage, 2-point advantage, I should say, according to the computer. This is around 2.5-point advantage. But instead, he plays queen takes f5, which is tempting, doubling these pawns. But the problem is now the dark square bishops get traded off. He goes bishop takes g7. What he needed to play was bishop g5. If you compare this to the line where the bishop guarded the queen, in that line the bishop was on f4, a stronger square. Here it's on g5. It's just these tiny differences, but that lost about half the advantage for Gukesh. But he makes an even worse move than bishop g5. He plays bishop takes g7, king takes g7. Still advantage Gukesh, but it's shrinking. Now we just have the one bishop against the knight instead of the bishop pair for white. Knight g6, rook takes c4. Gukesh is up a pawn, still has winning chances. Will we see Gukesh take the lead for the first time in the match? That's the exciting thing in this position. Knight to e5, forking rook and bishop. Rook d4, knight to c6, utilizing that pin on the d-pawn so white cannot take. Rook f4, knight to e7. And Ding is doing a good job here playing defense. Guards f5, double attacks this pawn on d5. b5 by Gukesh. And here you might be wondering what happens if black takes. Well, rook takes f5 turns out to be pretty good for white, actually. The rook and bishop are still very active in this position. So it's better to keep the knight here. Keep that pawn guarded, and the pawn does a nice job kind of defending this king still. It doesn't allow the white rook to come in and attack. Sort of limits the scope of this bishop as well. Now we see king f6, rook to d4, defending the pawn. h6. We're at move 39. Each player has to make one more move to reach move 40. That's when they get a bonus 30 minutes. Ding has 3 minutes from the black side. Gukesh has 7 minutes on the white side. King F1 played, gets his bonus time. And now we see a blunder by Ding. He used his whole 2.5 minutes or so, getting his clock down to 37 seconds, and he plays king to e5. King to e5 is a blunder. The strongest move was knight back to c8, sort of eyeing these defensive squares. He plays active with the king, which is a natural looking move, but now Gukesh gets rook h4. This h-pawn is going to drop unless he puts the knight on an extremely passive square, which is not easy to do, or puts his rook onto d6, which is not the 7th rank where he wants to have that defensive position kind of guarding everything on the 7th. So he plays knight takes d5, going for trades, and this gives Gukesh the passed h-pawn. So this is kind of the new winning chance for Gukesh. It used to be the d-pawn, now it's the passed h-pawn. Knight to c3, hitting this guy. Rook at c6, knight back to e4. You can't capture the pawn because of the fork, so rook c6 was a nice way to defend that pawn with tactics. King e1, f6, h4. Here comes that passed pawn. Passed pawns can pose problems in the endgame. Rook to d3. Bishop back to d1. This is a mistake by Gukesh. This flips the game from winning territory to probably drawn territory. And the reason why is the move that Ding ends up playing in the game. But here's the strongest continuation. King to e2, hitting the rook with the king. Let's say the rook drops back. And now b6. You trade off that queenside pawn. And the idea is you're still going to try to win with the h-pawn. And this king is boxed out by the rook. So there are some definite winning chances here. But still, I think it's also likely to be a draw. It might be 60, 70% chance to draw this for Ding with a 20 or 30% chance to win for Gukesh, or maybe even higher draw chances than that, 70 or 80% draw chance. But King e2 was the way to go. Bishop to d1 allows this move, which is the correct decision by Ding, pawn to f4. And the idea is once this g-pawn moves, the h-pawn becomes isolated. G takes, king takes. Now that h-pawn is unprotected, and it's easy for black to go after it. Bishop c2. Rook goes back. Rook c4, double attack. f5, good move. Rook to b4, defending. King f3. Bishop d1 check. King g2. Rook b3. And here Gukesh wants bishop f3 check, followed by bringing the king back up to e2. Kind of getting a more active position for his king. Rook e5. And both sides here have a lot of things to think about. Even though we don't have a ton of pieces on the board, there are tactics, right? You got to watch for forks. You got to watch for passed pawns running after a trade that are clear wins. In this position, Ding has 5 minutes and Gukesh is a little under 1 minute. And they're just getting an increment each move. There's no bonus time coming. Pawn to f4, rook e7, and watch for knight to c5 check. It's a discovered check, and that would be winning for Ding. Rook e3, rook h7, h5. The bishop defends it. Knight back to f6, trying to take that pawn. Rook e5, and we do see this swap. So Gukesh is still up 1 pawn. But the problem is it's not going to be enough with best play. And I'm going through these moves kind of quickly because they were played quickly in the game, and there's not a lot going on here. F-pawn's running up the board. Ding Liren's coming back to defend. Bishop c2, knight d6, and we can see Ding has a very nice defensive setup, and he's playing extremely accurately here. This is complete draw territory with best play, and essentially Ding is playing the best moves. King takes f6, so now we're equal on pawns, and they play it out, which I give them credit. Gukesh is still showing that, hey, I can play this out to the endgame. Then we see the sacrifice. Ding plays knight takes pawn here after king takes. There's no way you can checkmate with just a king and a bishop, so the players agree to a draw. Very exciting game. Good chances for Gukesh to come out with a win there. That's game 7 of the match, so we've reached the halfway point. Ding Liren does have an extra white game coming up because there's an odd number of games, 7 to play. I think this is still a promising game for Gukesh, showing that he can get a winning advantage against Ding. But Ding should also be happy that he could hold this position. He played really solid. He was bordering on that losing territory, but it was never quite that, hey, completely winning position for Gukesh. Things were always complicated enough, and Ding pulled ahead on the clock. That saved him in the end. So I think both players should be fairly happy with this game. All right, so we have another game tomorrow. I will be doing a recap and a game on Wednesday before our next rest day. So hope to see you guys in the next recap. Thank you for watching.